The Ukraine war has become one of the, if not the most important flashpoint of world relations in our time. If you read the official establishment media, the picture that you will get is that this was a war that was started and is taking place solely due to the megalomaniac ambitions of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. We on Against the Stream and in the Revolutionary Communist International have been analyzing the development of the conflict in Ukraine since its early days, going back to even before we had a conflict at this stage in the 90s, and consistently been analyzing the underlying processes that were taking place, which inevitably led to this particular moment in time where war broke out. However, in the past months of having this particular podcast, we've gotten a lot of comments, questions, criticisms of being pro-Russian, of being a Putin spokespeople. And we think that it's time to answer some of these questions that's come up. So we've decided to take up some of the main questions that's been raised and try to give them an answer and dive into what we don't really hear if we follow the news in the West on a daily basis, the real causes and reasons behind this event, and also the real solution to the situation in Ukraine. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. I'm here with Jorge Martin today. Jorge was also on the podcast last week. You weren't supposed to be here today.
No.
But this morning, Fred Weston, who's supposed to be here, and myself, we were preparing this episode. And as we were talking in the office, Jorge was just giving us all the facts of what happened, historical facts. Oh, yes, Kolomoisky did this, and then this happened, and that happened. And we thought, well, you know everything about this conflict. Why don't you come on the show?
Yeah. No, I don't know everything, but I remember that at the time in 2014, we were very heavily involved in analyzing, but also in organizing around the war in Ukraine. We set up the Solidarity with the Anti-Fascist Resistance in Ukraine campaign. Mm-hmm. So these things are in the back of my mind. The details of what happened, which many people today have either forgotten or they were never told.
And you have also written and collaborated in writing a whole series of very, very important and very good articles, I would say, that I've been reading. I've been reading up on a fraction of them here. You can see, for those of you who are not seeing the video, there's about, I don't know, a bit more than 100 pages there in A4. But and I think we're gonna make all those links available to our readers. I think they'll be very, very good for people to dive in and to get a true grasp of what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Because many of these things go back to 2014. Much of what's happening now goes back to 2014 and further. And there's one particular text that rereading it struck me as being very good, which was the IMT thesis on the war in Ukraine, which were passed in 2014. The IMT is the organization that preceded the Revolutionary Communist International. That is very good, but also, as you were saying, there's like 2, 3, 4 big long articles that Alan Woods wrote at that time in 2014 that I think go a lot into the detail to the background of the situation, the conflict between Western imperialism and Russia, the situation in Ukraine, restoration of capitalism. It's worth rereading.
Absolutely. With that out of the way, let's jump into the questions. The first question that often comes up, I mean, I'm rephrasing here because this question has come up in many, many ways.
Yes.
You know, people say, but Russia started the war. And that's the line. The line that we keep, there's a line that's been repeated ad nauseum in the Western press and media in general, is Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Now, that's the question. Was this an unprovoked war?
Well, the first thing that we need to say is that any war, and any war you take in history, there's always two sides, and one side always denounces the other as the aggressor. Is the first rule of war is that you always have to blame the other side.
No one ever starts.
No one ever starts. And in any case, wars do not happen because of provocations. Wars do happen because of underlying important reasons. And then provocations or justifications for the wars are made up, created, fabricated, and justified. I mean, this the Gulf of Tonkin incident in the Vietnam War, or the sinking of the Maine, the sinking of the Couvre in the Cuban Independence War. I mean, there's all sorts of Pearl Harbor. There's all sorts of incidents. Yes. The assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. This doesn't really explain. Yeah. And also, the war is not explained by who fired the first shot. So it is true that Russia invaded Ukraine on the, was it February 22? Was it 22nd of February, I think, 22? But that's not how the war started. That's not how the conflict started. That doesn't really allow us to see what's the underlying reason for this. And if you wanna find one single question or one main process that led to this war, I will say is the constant, provocative and relentless eastward push by NATO since the collapse of Stalinism in 1989-91.
Yes.
Which is contrary to what Western imperialism had promised the Russian rulers at the time. And I think that this is the main underlying dynamic that's behind this this war.
I'm just gonna to back you up there, because people might think, oh, this is just something you say. But we actually wrote an article in March 2022, so this is just after the war started, called How the West Prepared the Way for the Ukraine War by Nicholas, who is another one of the co-hosts here on this show. And obviously, what happened was, with the fall of the Soviet Union, what you also had was the problem of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a defensive pact of the Soviet states, the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, which was a counterforce to NATO, which was an anti-Soviet military alliance. And the problem that was posed by the West, they wanted the Warsaw Pact to be disbanded, right? And in order to do that, what they promised was many times that the NATO would not be expanded, even if Germany was unified and West Germany was a part of NATO. Yes. There would not be any NATO deployment on the former areas of the former East Germany. So we're not even talking about Eastern Europe yet.
No deployment of troops and no membership of NATO.
Precisely. Here is West German Foreign Minister Genscher, who gave a speech that in order not to harm the Soviet security interests, NATO should rule out expansion of its territory to the east, i.e. moving closer to the Soviet borders. This is not just a declaration of intention not to do so, but also recognizing that this is a threat to Russia, yes, and that Russia justifiably can see this as a threat to itself, or the Soviet Union as it was called at that time. Then there was a treaty on German unification, which was signed by the two German republics, the Soviet Union, France, the UK, and the US, which said that although the new united Germany was free to join NATO after the withdrawal of Soviet troops from East Germany, no foreign troops could be stationed in the former GDR. This was stated in an actual treaty, which then obviously was ignored. Then in 1990, 9th of February 1990, US Secretary of State James Baker said that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward if the Soviet Union accepted the new united Germany would join NATO. The next day, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl promised Gorbachev that NATO should not expand its scope. And the promises continue. There's a long list. You can Google.
These documents are now in the public domain. All of them.
There's loads and loads of them. John Major, in 1991, March 1991, John Major, the British Prime Minister, told Gorbachev that we're not talking about the strengthening of NATO, and that the question of NATO expansion, he said on that question, he said nothing of the sort will happen. Yeah, there's hundreds of quotes like this.
In fact, it makes sense. It makes logical sense as well, because NATO was supposed to be the justification for NATO was given for NATO was the threat of Soviet Russia, the threat of Soviet Union. Now here you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disbanding of the Soviet Union, the end of Stalinism, the restoration of capitalism in all of these countries. Why was there still a need to maintain this so-called defensive, in many inverted commas, military alliance of NATO?
Yes, because obviously, as we know, it didn't stop there. NATO expanded.
Yes.
Into the Eastern Bloc, into Germany, into the whole of the former Soviet spheres of influence.
The countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact.
And not only that, but what we also had was the actual nature of NATO when it intervened in Yugoslavia. Because this was the breakup of Yugoslavia was a Western project. German imperialism along with American imperialism. I mean, they say it was Milosevic who was the pure evil of Milosevic, but in reality, it was NATO and the West pushing into what was Russian sphere of influence, and you actually had at a certain stage almost a standoff between Russian troops and NATO troops. At
the Pristina airport.
Yes. Although that didn't, but that also shows the real nature of NATO. They're talking about Russia's bombardment of Ukraine, but the massive bombardment of Sarajevo and the whole of the Yugoslavia. Belgrade, sorry.
The NATO's bombardment of Belgrade, of Serbia, first of all went against the NATO Charter, which is supposed to be a self-defense organization. This was an offensive aggression. And they bombed all sorts of things. I remember very well. They bombed the Chinese embassy, which was a clear provocation. They bombed hospitals, they bombed markets, they bombed the building of the TV station in Belgrade with journalists inside. Lots of civilians died. And this was a serious warning for Russia and the Russian ruling class and military elite. There was a warning from the West saying, okay, we are attacking one of your traditional allies and spheres of influence in Serbia, and perhaps next you will be next. And this was in the context of constant expansion of NATO eastwards into Romania, the Baltic countries, Poland. Not only the expansion of NATO, but also the stationing of troops, the threat of stationing of missiles. And this at a time when the Cold War allegedly had already finished. But the West, US imperialism still considered Russia as an enemy. Even though Russia was at this time ruled by people that were completely subservient to the West, Yeltsin and so on.
Yes, I mean, this is at a time where after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have a deep crisis in Russia. The Russian economy collapses. I was looking at the Ukrainian economy. Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. The economy declined by 60% of GDP. People went from full employment to half of the population being under the poverty line. Millions of people fled the country. Everything collapsed. Mass privatization followed by looting of the privatized of the former state-owned companies. This was the same situation in Russia, obviously.
Everywhere, the collapse of living standards, the collapse of life expectancy, massive epidemic of alcoholism, suicide, general collapse of the cultural standards. It was a complete disaster. Ted Grant, I think, said it can only be compared to a country having lost a war twice over.
And in this situation, obviously, Russia, which was still had a powerful army and a you can say,
nuclear arsenal
and so on. But it was weak to offer any resistance. In fact, as you said, Yeltsin was a puppet of the Americans. You had these videos of Yeltsin and former President Clinton on stage, where Clinton is just laughing at Yeltsin, who's drunk. And you can imagine the feeling of humiliation that the Russian peoples would have. But also that is an indication of the arrogance with which the Americans acted in Russia and in what was Russia's former Soviet spheres. Now they took this situation. They took advantage of it in order to expand NATO. In 1999, they expanded to the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, which are major countries, major economies in the area. Then in 2004, it was Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And in 2009, Albania and Croatia. And then Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020. Obviously, lately we've had Sweden and Finland. And they called this a defense pact. And you would wonder, what are they defending themselves against? The idea that NATO has been involved in 3 major operations in its history. It's Yugoslavia, it's the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and Libya.
A country that never attacked NATO. None of these 3 countries ever attacked
exactly.
NATO.
So where is the defense in all of this? But what is actually correct is that what they did, they're talking about building up a missile defense shield. There's 2 elements of this. During the Cold War, there was a positioning game of who can strike each other the first between the Soviet Union and the US. Whose nuclear bombs, basically, and missiles can reach each other first. A missile defense shield has two so-called shield has 2 roles. One, it defends from a very close range, but it also moves. The same installations that can defend against a missile can also send off missiles. And that's the whole point, is that you actually came within the range of Moscow with the whole number of missiles. I mean, they had that even before, but with much more, with a wider range of missiles. And it was a direct threat. It was, and this is, again, you can read it in many different military kind of articles and so on. It was about who can strike first. It was about gaining the advantage of the first strike. That was the first thing. But secondly, it was also economic expansion of German imperialism at that particular time, and American imperialism. But from a German point of view, it was about pushing Russia out, pushing Russian economic interests out of these regions, using their cheap labor for the setting up of factories and industries, and also obviously using the market for the sale of their own goods. And thirdly, there was the idea of actually moving troops and military outposts closer to the Soviet Union. I have a quote here. This is a cable from a US ambassador in 2008. And
US ambassador to where?
To Russia.
Oh, okay.
He sent a whole series during the 2007s and 8s. He sent a whole series of cables warning about how Russia viewed the actions of the West. This was at a time where they were now talking about Ukraine and Georgia also entering the UN. They were actually asking.
That was at the Bucharest summit in 2008. Yes.
And he says, during his annual review of Russia's foreign policy at the end of January, Foreign Minister Lavrov stressed that Russia had to view continued eastward expansion of NATO, particularly to Ukraine and Georgia, as a potential military threat. While Russia might believe statements from the West that NATO was not directed against Russia, when one looked at recent military activities in NATO countries, i.e. the establishment of US forward operation locations, etc., they had to be evaluated not by stated intentions, but by potential. Lavrov stressed that maintaining Russia's sphere of influence in the neighborhood was anachronistic. So that he didn't believe that Russia could expect these to be just Russian spheres of influence. and acknowledged that the US and Europe had legitimate interests in the region. But, he argued, while countries were free to make their own decisions about their security and which political military structures to join, they need to keep in mind the impact on their neighbors. Mm-hmm. What is the meaning of this?
That doesn't seem very aggressive. It seems actually quite mild and compromising.
Yes, but it's the assessment that they have.
Yeah.
What is this? Is actually you are moving your armies. The U.S. at this time was building military bases, NATO military bases, all over Eastern Europe. Where were these soldiers to go? Where were these soldiers? What were they to do?
Furthermore, immediately after that, or shortly after that 2008 summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were invited to join NATO, and it was stated in the memorandum, that this is the final aim, is that these two countries should be full members of NATO. Then the United States withdrew from the medium-range missile non-proliferation agreement, which is obviously taken by Russia as another aggressive move. Why would you stop having these talks about removing medium-range missiles from Europe? Why?
Yeah.
I mean, it can only be interpreted in one way. And Lavrov is not wrong when he says that rather than listening to the words of the West, we're gonna look at their actual actions. Yeah.
I was talking to Fred actually the other day, and he was saying, it's like you're sitting in your house, and you see at the end of the street someone building up a big fortress and bringing in a cannon and pointing it at your house. And then you go and talk to them, and they say, no, this is just for defensive purposes. I'm just defending myself. I mean, we have no intentions of it. And then they take the other house on the other side of the of the street, and they say the same thing. And then they get closer and closer and closer, and then they start talking with your neighbor, saying, what are you gonna?
This is like, I think we have explained this before with an analogy. This is like, let's imagine for a moment that Russia enters into a military alliance with Canada and Mexico, and then decides to install missiles in these two countries. Will the United States just accept it as the sovereign right of any nation? No, they will take great offense at this, quite rightly. I mean, when in 1962 the Soviet Union decided to install missiles on the island of Cuba, which is 90 miles from the United States, the United States created a massive complaint that there was a big crisis that nearly led to was very close to a nuclear war, and finally pushed the Soviet missiles out of Cuba because it considered it was a threat to its national security interest. This is a completely analogous situation that we have here.
In fact, a few years ago, I was reading an article in Stratfor, which is this geopolitics magazine. I have to say, they can be a bit sensationalist, but because they're sensationalists, they often say more openly what American strategists are thinking. And what they were saying about the Ukraine was that Ukraine, you see, there's a difference between Ukraine and Hungary or Estonia or even any other, because Ukraine was a very integrated part of the Soviet Union. It was one country, more or less. There was no border to speak of. We've said this before. People would go to Kiev. Russians would go to Kiev. Everyone spoke Russian. The culture, the common history, the struggle against Nazism in the World War II. There was it's not that there wasn't a Ukrainian national question, because of the crimes of Stalinism, really. But this was one people, one economy,
a very integrated
one culture,
economy,
one movies, books, lots of Ukrainian popular authors, lots of Russians. There was no real distinguishing factor. And even I think Kissinger says this many times. He says you can't compare Ukraine with any other country because this country is so integrated into Russia. And Stratfor was saying Stratfor was saying, this was the editor of Stratfor, he said, Ukraine would be an outpost for further operations into Russia, military or political. What does that mean? If you have Ukraine, let's say, as a hostile and the hostile entity opposed to the Russian regime. It's not just militarily, although there's also a military aspect of it, but it's also culturally that you can become a safe haven for oppositionists and a conduit of propaganda material, which Ukraine was. I mean, you have now the whatever is left of the liberal opposition in Russia is in Kiev, or is one way or another connected to the Kiev regime.
Yeah. There's another factor that at the time of Ukrainian independence, I mean, the whole thing is extremely controversial because there was an original referendum in which people voted against independence and for the maintenance of the Soviet Union. But then there was overruled by a later referendum. But in any case, at the time when the independence agreement was signed between what was at the time still the Soviet Union and Ukraine, there was a rule there, a clause, that said that Ukraine will be a neutral country that will never be part of any military bloc, and that no foreign troops will be stationed in Ukraine, which seems like a reasonable question. Then
this is what Lavrov is saying.
That's right. This later on, at the time when the Ukrainian constitution was signed, this language was not so specific, but it was understood that Ukraine was a neutral country because it's also Ukraine is in between Russia and Europe, right? It has one foot on each side, and this was always historically, even before the Soviet Union, this was always historically the case. Ukrainian nationalists, whenever they've tried to set up their own country, ended up being puppets of German imperialism, of French imperialism, Western imperialism, basically in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and so on. And this was always the case. So the fact that now, over many years, there was a push, a constant, relentless push to remove this condition of neutrality and non-alignment of Ukraine. And some people say, okay, yeah, but the Ukrainian people have the right to decide which military alliance they want to be part of. Yeah, but this has very little to do with the Ukrainian people. There was no opinion poll that showed the Ukrainians wanted to be part of NATO right up until 2022, in fact. Nevertheless, there was a constant push by a section of the oligarchs in Ukraine and by NATO and US imperialism. They were pushing for this. In 2019, was it? They put it in the constitution in a very provocative way. They put in the constitution that the final strategic aim of Ukraine was to join the European Union and NATO. This is all a provocation for Russia. Now, this doesn't mean that we are Marxists, we are communists. We do not defend the interest of the ruling class of Russia. But however, what is very clear is that the ruling class in the West knew perfectly well that this was seen as a provocation by Russia. Whether you agree or not, this was seen as a provocation, and that if you took any more steps like this, Russia would at certain point respond and therefore provoke a war. So who provoked the war? I mean, the question answers itself.
Exactly. That gets us to this. There's this article that's it's become quite notorious in anyone who's trying to understand this war. It's called "A Strategy for Avoiding Two-Front War." It's written by Wes Mitchell, and it was published in The National Interest in August 2021. So this is about 6 months before the Russian invasion started. And I think it's very interesting. This is at a time where it has a lot of interesting points. It is a part of the discussion in the US security establishment. That's something you see in many of these magazines. In the past 10 years, there's been a discussion about how can the US maintain its position as a dominant imperialist power, the hegemonic discussion, so to say, and should it even do that? That is with an eye to the rise of China, the development of Russia as a military power, and so on. How can the U.S. maintain its position at the top of the the food chain of world capitalism, so to say. And it says that initially, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. had no real threat towards them, and they had a position of they had a defense doctrine of being able to fight two wars, one in the Middle East and one in Asia. But that was at a time where Russia was very weak.
Yeah.
And he says they ran Europe like their own backyard. They did whatever they pleased. They waited, they broke up Yugoslavia, no repercussions. They stationed NATO troops everywhere. They changed governments. They had all these very, very corrupt governments installed in the former Eastern Bloc. That was not a problem for them. But then China started developing and becoming an important economic and also an important military power. The most important threat to U.S. domination in its history since World War II. And then also also Russia. And he says that the problem that we face is the problem of simultaneity, i.e. we can't say i.e. I keep saying i.e. but our comrade Alan Woods have told us that is wrong. We have to say that is, or in other words. Anyway, the problem of simultaneity, in other words, if the U.S. is faced by Russia and China together. So if Russia, challenges U.S. domination in Europe or in Eastern Europe, and then China does the same in Asia
at the same time.
The U.S. would not be able to fight back because it would have the combined resources of this huge landmass and 3 or 4 billion people behind it with very advanced militaries and so on and so forth. So he says, well, how can we get through this? How can we solve this problem? And he says, rather than trying to contain Russia and China simultaneously, the US needs to find a way to stagger its contests with these two powers to ensure that it does not face both at the same time in a war. That's a very cold-blooded and calculated strategy, which is how the bourgeois think. It says we can't take them on both. We need to stagger them. We need to take them one at a time. And then he says, but how can we do that? He discusses the different ways of doing this. Rather than attempting to woo or court Russia into a conciliatory stance, we should present it with a combination of insuperable obstacles to westward expansion. By westward expansion, they mean we shouldn't allow Russia to gain influence in Eastern Europe, which is ours. That's what they mean. Yeah. That's what they mean. Including, if necessary, by inflicting a far more serious defeat than it has hitherto experienced in Ukraine, while presenting new opportunities for cooperation, investment, and growth in Russia's east. Simply put, the goal should be to alleviate America's simultaneity problem by giving Russia incentives to be less of a European power and more than an Asian one. I mean, the cynicism of this, trying to determine what countries should do. You should be a power in Asia, and you should not be a power in Europe, where we have it.
You should fight China, which is our enemy, instead of defying us. And if you don't do that, because it says there very clearly that there should be incentives, there should be also a stick, insuperable obstacles.
Yeah. Exactly. He says there are two options, basically. We can either fight Russia first or China first. He says, if we want to fight China first, we want to woo. The first option is to bring on board Russia and then to fight China. But he says, but the Russians don't have any interest in coming on board. They have good trade with the Chinese. They're doing fine. They have a pretty strong military. They're not in a situation where they need America. And the Chinese definitely don't have any desire to come particularly closer to us. But then he says, there's not really any good options, but we need to therefore force Russia to have an interest in collaborating with us. He says, if history is any indication, Russia only takes a détente with an adversary seriously after it has been forced to do so by a defeat or serious setback. This was as much a precondition for Ronald Reagan's success at Reykjavik after the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan as it was for the English statesmen who brokered the Anglo-Russian Entente after Russia's defeat at Port Arthur in 1905. The equivalent of Port Arthur, he goes on a bit further down, the equivalent of Port Arthur or Afghanistan today is Ukraine. The United States should wish to see Russia suffer a military rebuff of sufficient magnitude to prompt its leaders to reassess their assumptions about the permissiveness of the post-Soviet spaces as a preferred zone of strategic expansion. America can help bring about this outcome much as it did in Afghanistan by providing locals the means to better resist Russia at higher volumes than it has done to date, and encouraging European allies to do the same.
This is uncanny. Because it's exactly what they did.
This is exactly what they did. This is clearly exactly what the Biden administration tried to do. In fact, in the whole of that period, Russia was having a buildup of troops on the border with Ukraine, and they kept saying, Ukraine must be neutral. Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO. They see the provocations by the Americans, and now they see that NATO membership has been written into the constitution. We'll get to that, but you have now a very hostile anti-Russian regime in Ukraine, which is arming itself, building up its military capabilities, building up its setting up a new state structure which does not involve any pro-Russian or any Russian interests. And they're saying you need to back down from this buildup. And the Americans refused. In fact, repeatedly, even though they had no intentions of this is the paradox. The Americans never had any intentions of actually allowing Ukraine into NATO.
No.
But they refused to take it off the cards.
Yeah.
It's solely for the purpose of
in fact, if
war.
you read what the Russians said in 2021, even up to December, they said let's have a discussion about a new security architecture for Europe.
Yes.
They wanted to say, okay, look, you're coming up close to our borders. You're installing, you're getting all these countries into your military alliance. You're getting all these missiles here and there, stationing troops. Please, can we calm down and discuss what is all this about, and how can we guarantee our own national security interests, which are the interests of the ruling class of Russia, nothing to do with us. But from the point of view of who was provoking who, you have a long a history of years and years and years of Western provocation for this particular reason. They wanted to use Ukraine to inflict Russia a military defeat, which will force Russia to collaborate in inverted commas with the West and break with China. It was also an attempt to weaken China, which was Russia's ally.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Mitt Romney, U.S. senator, Republican senator, in March 2023, it was a year after the war started. He tweeted, this is a famous tweet, we've quoted this before. It says, Putin's Russia is not our friend, and it is China's most powerful ally. Supporting Ukraine weakens an adversary, enhances our national security advantage, i.e. U.S. imperialism, and requires no shedding of American blood. This is the cynical calculation.
Using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder in a provoked conflict with Russia for the benefit of whom? Not for the benefit of the sovereignty or national self-determination of Ukraine, for the benefit of the interest of US multinationals, finance, capital, and imperialism in general.
Meanwhile, also at the same time, the US was building the new Maidan regime, the new Ukrainian regime, which for years, I mean, after the Soviet Union, there was always an unstable back and forth between Ukrainian oligarchs leaning more towards Russia and then leaning more towards the West. But after 2014, the US started building a new Ukrainian military. NATO started, we've quoted this before, I think, tens of thousands of new Ukrainian officers were trained by NATO. new NATO, standards were introduced in the Ukrainian army.
To allow for interoperability.
Exactly. Connections were fostered that were then strengthened immensely after the war started. The New York Times has just published an article not so long ago where they explain how the war, right from the early stages, was directed 100% from the Wiesbaden headquarters of NATO, where all the main Ukrainian generals were led there, and then the war was conducted from there. So it just shows what was actually happening, the integration of Ukraine into the Western imperialist machine.
Not just that, but with the aim of with an aggressive aim towards Russia.
Exactly.
Quite clearly.
There's another couple of quotes. Just to reiterate it, I just found it in my notes here. Even by the year 2000. Oh, this is interesting because there's a very interesting article. I don't have the title of it here, but I can post it in the description. But there's an article that I found on a website called Countercurrent, which goes into all of the ways that Russians expressed how they saw NATO as a threat. By the year 2000, the Russian National Security Strategy, is an official document, warned that NATO's use of force beyond its borders would be seen as a threat of destabilization of the whole strategic situation. This was right after Yugoslavia. While military officers and politicians started claiming, quote, that if NATO expands further, it could create a base to intervene in Russia itself. So everyone were open about this. But here's the interesting thing, because it was actually Putin, when he arrived, for the first many years, Putin was arguing for a Russian entrance into Ukraine, into NATO, and much closer collaboration of Russia with NATO. So again, here you have...
Basically, what he was saying is, look, we are now capitalists. There shouldn't be a fundamental conflict between you and us. If you give us a space, a seat at the table in equal conditions, that we can talk. But no, we will reach an agreement. But no, the Western imperialism wanted to humiliate and dominate and subordinate Russia to itself.
Yeah.
So
now let's go a bit further back, because in the meantime, what we have in 2014 was the Maidan protest movement, which changed everything. Can you explain what?
Yeah, for many years since independence, Ukraine had been ruled by different parties that more or less alternated in power. There was also another big protest movement in 2005, the so-called Orange Revolution, and different parties, all political parties in Russia, were in the pay of different oligarchs. Okay, now we call them oligarchs, as if that was a bad thing. But these are capitalist magnates that basically looted state property. They dealt with each other by eliminating each other. They had different interests. Some of them controlled one part of the country. Some of them controlled another part of the country, particular industry. And they all had their political avenues into the Rada, the parliament. And basically all parties defended the interests of the oligarchs, basically. The only thing is that because of the position of Ukraine between Russia and Europe, the oligarchs, they will try to balance one against the other. So some of them were pushing for alliance with the European Union, and there was an attempt to form a European Union-Ukraine partnership agreement. But at the same time, they were looking towards the east, the Ukrainian industry, particularly in the south and the southeast, the most industrial areas, where there's coal mining, steel mills, industrial production, and so on. They were linked to traditionally, historically linked to the economy of the Soviet Union, and now they still maintain all these links with Russia. And so some of these oligarchs based in the south, they were leaning more towards an economic alliance and political alliance with Russia, which at that time had the Confederation of Independent States. But these oligarchs were very cynical. They weren't pro-West or pro-Russian. They were just pro-themselves.
Pro-profit.
Pro-profit, pro-loot. They wanted the loot and as much loot as possible. So there had been this back and forth. From the beginning, there was a conscious attempt by Western imperialism to bring Ukraine into its sphere of influence. And they used a lot of money from US aid, which now Trump has disbanded, for many years, promoting and funding so-called civil society organizations, NGOs, so-called independent media. This had nothing to do with the interest of the Ukrainians, but the interest of Western Washington, basically. Anyway, so these oligarchs were leaning one side, they were leaning the other side. And then finally in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, Yanukovych, who was the then president of the Party of Regions. The Party of Regions represented or had a social base, electoral base of support, mainly in the south, the east of the country, where there's also a bigger percentage of population who speak Russian, basically represented the interest of those oligarchs in those regions. And he was about to sign a deal with the European Union. Partnership agreement, I think it was called, with the European Union. But at this time, the European Union was in crisis. We're talking about 2013. This is after the 2008 recession, the debt crisis all over Europe. And Europe was no longer in a position to cough up the necessary amount of money to integrate another Eastern European country into the European Union, as they had done before with others. And also they were afraid. Ukraine is a very populous country. If they allowed Ukraine into Europe, there would be a massive influx of cheap labor, and they didn't have this was not a time of economic growth in Europe. They couldn't absorb Ukraine, really. So the offer that Germany, the European Union, was making to Ukraine was not so good. And at the same time, they were under pressure. Yanukovych was under pressure from Russia, saying, "Okay, no, if you sign, not join European Union, but sign this partnership agreement, then you cannot be part of the Confederation of Independent States, the Commonwealth of Independent States, as it was called." And therefore, at the last minute, in these conditions where the European Union wasn't offering much, and Russia was putting pressure the other way, Yanukovych decided not to sign. On the eve, I think on the day before of the signing of this document, he said, "No, I'm not going to sign." And then all of a sudden, protests started. There were many different reasons for this protest. There was corruption. There were people who were genuinely against the oligarchs who were in power and so on. But clearly, there was a push from Western imperialism behind these protests. And there were different elements involved. There were obviously a lot of people who had many illusions in the European Union. They said, okay, the situation is so bad here in Ukraine, if we join the European Union, we will have European Union living standards, or at least we will be able to emigrate to the European Union, get jobs there. So it was an element of desperation that way. And there was obviously also a strong element of reactionary Ukrainian nationalism, which was represented by the far-right neo-Nazi fascist gangs that started participating in the protest, and they provided like the shock troops. And they didn't dominate the whole protest politically. It was mainly dominated by the pro-Western bourgeois politicians, but they were the shock troops, so they played an important role. And they were based on this idea, the ideology is based on reclaiming the legacy of those Ukrainian reactionary nationalists, Bandera and others of the the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. Why did they collaborate with the Nazis? Because of the anti-Russian sentiment. They said, okay, the Nazis did promise or hinted that they will give Ukrainians an independent state, and so they sided with the Nazis. Deliberately, they knew what they were doing. Some of them joined the Galicia division of the SS, so this is an openly Nazi organization, and they joined as volunteers, and they carried out massacres and pogroms against the Poles in Volhynia and Galicia. They carried out massacres, anti-Semitic massacres of the Jews in a number of different places, including in Kiev, but also in eastern Ukraine. So these are the people who provided the ideology for this neo-fascist, neo-Nazi gangs during Maidan, right? They were not hiding their
during
ideology.
This protest movement, yes.
They were openly espousing this movement. And the West didn't seem to have a problem with this. On the contrary, these people were quite useful because they were doing the street fighting against the police and so on. With what aim? The aim of overthrowing the Yanukovych government, which, I mean, we're not pro-Yanukovych. This is an oligarchic reactionary government, but had been democratically elected. Okay, there was a protest movement, but they wanted to overthrow it by force. And the West were not just spectators, they were directly involved in this effort by providing money for some of these organizations. But also, incredibly, there were people like John McCain, who was a Republican senator from the United States, who spoke on Maidan Square to the crowds, flanked by these fascists on stage. Now, just imagine, let's say for argument's sake, that there's a Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, millions of people are on the streets, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, Dmitry Peskov or Lavrov turns up at a protest rally in Minneapolis and says, yes, and we're now going to overthrow this government. I mean, just imagine.
Maybe more if there was a redneck right-wing protest.
Yeah, I mean, let's say there is a Trump, a rabble of Trump supporters trying to take over the Capitol, and then all of a sudden Medvedev turns up and he says, yes, let's storm the Congress. I mean, this is the exact equivalent. But anyway, this is what they were doing. Finally, Yanukovych was overthrown. The whole detail, we're not going to go into the details, but in fact, Yanukovych had already signed a deal that involved him stepping down and a orderly transition of power, perhaps new elections and so on. And precisely at that time, the more radical elements in the Maidan, i.e. the more fascist elements, that is, they decided that this was not enough, that he needed to be overthrown. And then there was this mysterious event of the snipers. Snipers were shooting at the crowd. People were killed. I think dozens of people were killed, including some police officers as well. People were killed on both sides. Yeah. And there is a Ukrainian researcher, Ivan Kachanovsky, I think his name is. He has produced a detailed forensic investigation, and he's concluded that, in fact, the snipers were shooting from buildings that were under the control of the far-right forces. It was a provocation in order to enrage people further and provoke the overthrow of the old regime. So much so that when the new government came in, there was a period of a provisional government and before there were any elections. Then we had this amazing spectacle of Victoria Nuland, who was what, the assistant U.S.
Deputy State Secretary of State.
Yeah, she was having a conversation with someone and deciding who was going to be the next president of Ukraine.
Yeah, she was having a conversation with Jeffrey Pratt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. She was the Assistant Secretary of State, and she was also a deputy in Biden's government until 2 years ago. Yes, where she stepped down. So she's been involved for a long time. And in this conversation, this is 3 weeks, as far as I understand, this is 3 weeks before Yanukovych was overthrown. And they are talking about which government to form. This shows the level of US involvement.
Which people should be in the government specifically, they say.
And Piats, I don't know how you say his name. He says, I think your argument, he's talking about Vitaly Klitschko, who's this old boxer, who's the mayor of Kiev. Yeah. He says, I think your argument to him, which you need to make, I think it's the next phone call you need to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yats, which is Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who became prime minister.
Provisional prime minister.
He says, I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot. This shows that this has been going on for a while. I'm glad that you put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad that he said what he said in response. And then Nuland says, good. I don't think Klitschko should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In fact, what was happening is that Klitschko was the man of the Germans. It was the guy who was closest to the Germans in this whole operation. And the United States didn't want the Germans to have any say.
Push him aside.
Yeah.
And then he goes further. Nuland says, I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. What he needs is Klitschko and someone else that I can't. Tianibuk on the outside. He needs to be talking to them.
This Tianibuk was the leader of Svoboda, the more openly fascist party.
He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitschko going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's not going to work. So anyway, and this is a long conversation. People could Google it and find it.
So you can find the actual audio because it's been published. But this is completely scandalous. It's the United States administration deciding who's going to be part of this government. And then they tell us that this is all about Ukrainian self-determination and sovereignty.
And democracy. This is the thing, because actually what we're going into is the second question, which often comes up. Ukraine is fighting for democracy. What we have in Ukraine is an open democracy. And yet what we see here is actually the most
it's a colony of the United States.
It's a colonial relationship.
Not only this, but the regime that was installed after the Maidan, because of the participation of these far-right elements, started to glorify Bandera, the Nazi collaborators in World War II, and this was extremely provocative for a large number. Ukraine is one of the countries where the biggest percentage of people died in fighting Nazi Germany in World War II. So this was a complete scandal. Monuments to the Red Army. The Red Army wasn't a Russian army, it was a Soviet army, right? Which involved millions of Ukrainians who died fighting the Nazis. So monuments were being removed. Victory Day parades were being banned or attacked by fascist mobs. The Communist Party offices were being raided and attacked, ransacked. Finally, the Communist Party was made illegal. Now, we don't support the politics of the Communist Party, which were really horrible Stalinist politics. But nevertheless, this party was removed from political life by force and by law. And then on top of this, there were attacks on the status of the Russian language, which is spoken by, I don't know, maybe 40% of the population as a mother tongue. So this all built up to a situation where basically they were moving towards breaking up Ukraine into two completely different camps. This is exactly what happened immediately after the Maidan overthrow of Yanukovych and the installation of another government, which was really a puppet government of the United States, and which contained far-right elements. Then what you had was the anti-Maidan protests, which started in a whole number of places, in Kharkov, in Odessa, in Dnipro, in Luhansk, in Donetsk, in all the regions where there's the highest percentage of Russian speakers, and the people had not participated so much in the Maidan movement. And these people said, okay, well, so if the Maidan movement can overthrow a government, why can we not overthrow a government in defense of our rights? And they saw their rights as both social, national and democratic rights, basically, because also many of the workers in the south and the east of Ukraine, they could understand that when they're talking about the economic experience of Yatsenyuk, what they meant was the privatization of all these plants, the closure of steel mills and coal mines and so on, and the decimation, economic industrial decimation of the east of Ukraine, as had already happened in many other eastern countries. So the movement was coming from many different angles, and it became a mass movement. Within this movement, there were different elements. There were pro-Russian or Russian nationalist elements, including some really right-wing reactionary Russian monarchists and so on. But also there were people who were inspired or who were moved by Soviet nostalgia, let's put it this way.
Yes.
The idea that, well, in the past, under the Soviet regime, we lived better, we had good jobs and good cultural level, which is a progressive thing. Mm-hmm. There were other people who were inspired more openly by communist ideas, of the general idea of anti-fascist struggle, the struggle during the Second World War. So it was a mixed bag, but there were also there were clear left-wing elements. At some point, some of the miners were protesting in the Donbas basin. There was some factory takeovers. There was the creation of new communist parties and new communist organizations. This was in the first months of that movement. You cannot say that the anti-Maidan movement, which eventually led to the formation of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, was just the result of Russian agents and Russian influence. Yeah. There were Russian agents, quite clearly, but this was not the cause for that mass movement, which led to open clashes, killings, the massacre in Odessa on May the 2nd, and all of that.
Yes, let's just talk about what happened in Odessa.
Yeah, there had been all this protest, and then for months, right?
Yes.
And already in April, in mid-April, there was an uprising in Sloviansk, which was started by a very strange character, this guy Strelkov, who now we know is called Igor Girkin, who was a Russian guy who was Second World War or First World War reenact a monarchist, a reactionary guy. But he got together a group of armed men and took over the town hall in Sloviansk. And he found quite a lot of support amongst the people, because the people didn't want to be part of this Maidan regime that was glorifying Bandera and the Nazi collaborators. So anyway, this had already happened in April. And then there were still big demonstrations in Odessa. There had been clashes before. And this was coming up to Victory Day on May the 9th, right? So a number of anti-Maidan protesters had set up a protest camp, like the Maidan, more or less imitating the same methods. They set up a protest camp outside the House of Trade Unions in Odessa. Now, the House of Trade Unions at this time had nothing to do with the trade unions anymore, but it was the building that used to be the House of Trade Unions, and it was a big building in a main square called Kulikovo Field in the center of Odessa, and they were there. And then one day there was to be a football match. And the football hooligans from many of these teams, the Dnipro and others, were organized in fascist gangs, paid and funded by people like Kolomoisky, who was the main oligarch that controlled Dnipro, the city. So these people were paid, they were heavily armed and motivated, and they set up for a confrontation. They were armed with all sorts. And then the anti-Maidan elements in Odessa decided to defend themselves. They were also armed, and so there were clashes throughout the city. But the fascist mob, heavily outnumbered the anti-Maidan elements, and they chased them all the way into this building. They destroyed the camp, which was outside, and they chased them into the building of the House of Trade Unions. And then they started throwing Molotov cocktails to the building. Now there are images of this, there are videos that you can see, and the people inside the building were also throwing Molotov cocktails outside. And one way or another, the building was set on fire. And then the fascist gangs outside prevented people from coming out. So dozens of people died inside of the inhalation of fumes and so on. Some people jumped from the top windows. They were killed by impact. Others that managed to come out then were beaten to death, including a member of the communist youth. And so it was really a massacre. It was a pogrom.
And then those who survived were arrested.
Yeah. Hundreds of them were arrested. And then they were released by a crowd of anti-Maidan protesters, went to the police station and released them on the days after. To this day, there has been no proper investigation of any of this. Not in Ukraine, not anywhere else. And it's quite clear that this was a serious warning, and people started to get really, really worried at this
You can imagine what effect that will have, that these kind of thugs, with the protection of the state, carry out this what effect that would have had on the Russian-speaking part
in Donetsk, in Luhansk, and in all of these places. Yes.
And you see,
so people started taking over public buildings in the whole region of Donetsk and Luhansk, and after a few days they declared People's Republic.
Yeah.
And they wanted, at this time, more or less at this time, this is when Russia intervened in Ukraine, in Crimea.
Yes.
They took over Crimea, because we need to remember another element in this whole
equation.
equation.
Ask you about this, but go ahead.
No, another element in this whole equation is that Crimea is the place, is the site for the naval, for a very important naval base of Russia in Simferopol, which controls the whole of the Black Sea.
Yeah.
And they will have never allowed that to fall into the hands of Ukrainian pro-Western imperialist reactionary nationalists.
Yeah.
It was against the interest. So they decided to invade Crimea, which in any case is an area where there's strong support for Russia. There's about 80% Russian speakers, and historically has been part of Russia. And all
I think just to finish that off, I think Crimea is quite indicative of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, because Crimea is essentially a Russian peninsula. There's Russian speakers, ethnically Russian people. It was made Ukrainian by administrative decree.
By
Khrushchev, as a kind of a goodwill gesture, which didn't mean anything in the Soviet Union at that time. But what's also interesting is that even after the formal separation of the two countries, even after Ukrainian independence, even though this is a key, vital, strategic military port for Russia, there was never any talk of Russia taking it over again, because there wasn't the idea of a border between the two countries wasn't as prevalent as it is today. Yeah. It was in many.
There are other elements. There are other elements to this, because in fact, if Crimea is now so predominantly Russian ethnic in its composition, is also because Stalin deported the Crimean Tatars. He accused the whole people of collaborating with the Nazis, which wasn't the case. I mean, some people collaborated, some people were part of the Red Army. And he decided to deport all of them to, I don't know, Central Asia somewhere, thus changing the ethnic makeup of Crimea. Yeah. And then there's another element to this, which is that when the Maidan movement started and Yanukovych was removed, the new regime came in, they started threatening Crimea. Yeah. They cut off the water supply to Crimea, and there was a whole provocations around that.
And the Russians had a referendum, which overwhelmingly voted in favor.
Yeah, the referendum took place under Russian military occupation, but I'm perfectly convinced that had there not been Russian military occupation, they would have voted the same way. Because also for many people in Crimea, Russia means the military base and high wages and better living standards. And anyway, they felt that way.
And so the Donbas republics
were
saw
created
this as a model. Because obviously they now felt existentially threatened.
Yeah, but at this time, Russia was not particularly interested in taking over the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, because these were places where there was old industries. It will have been an economic burden, and they preferred to have Donetsk and Luhansk as part of Ukraine as a way of Russia exercising kind of a veto or some power inside Ukraine. Yeah. So finally, an agreement was reached after a military defeat. But let's just go a little bit back. When they declared, when these buildings, public buildings, were taken over and so on, how did the Kiev regime respond? The Yanukovych regime responded to Maidan by sending the Berkut, the special anti-riot police, and they were quite brutal. But the Kiev regime responded to these protests in its own country by sending the army. They declared the anti-terrorist operation, which started on the same day as the Odessa massacre on May the 2nd, 2014. And they basically sent the army against the civilian population. Yes. But what happened next was really incredible, because I remember following this closely. There were Western journalists at the time, including one, Oliphant, who was writing for The Telegraph and others. And they reported this in detail, right? The army arrived there. And these were conscript soldiers. from more or less the same regions, badly paid, badly trained, badly equipped, and they were being sent to fight a Russian invasion.
Yeah,
they were told.
That's what they thought.
But when they arrived in these places, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Komsomolskoye, and all these places, what they found was the people. The people who lived in these places were like them. They could have been their neighbors, their relatives. Some of them probably were. And these people were talking to them and said, no, don't fight us. We are the people here. Why are you fighting us? You are our army. And the army collapsed, disbanded. They started fraternizing with these people, refused to advance. The army had tanks and armored vehicles. The people had nothing. They were just going there and talking to. There's videos of this.
Yes.
And the army collapsed. So what did the Kiev regime do next? They used the fascists who had played a key role in the Maidan overthrow, and they organized them in the National Guard, in first volunteer forces, paid by the oligarchs like Kolomoisky and others. And then they gave them legal cover under the National Guard. And now the fascists had weapons. And they were armed by the state and by the West. And they formed these National Guard brigades, the Azov Brigade. But it wasn't just Azov. There were many others. Svoboda had their own, Centuria, the Carpathian, Sikh, and others. Brotherhood. There was a whole number of fascist gangs who were now being
incorporated into the state.
Army training, incorporated into the state, and sent to places to fight the local population, like in Mariupol, where they took over by killing people and so on. In the meantime, the army was now reorganizing and shelling these places. Now, people talk about the Russians shelling Ukraine, which is happening and obviously causes also civilian deaths. But for a period of nearly, for a period of 5 or 6 years, there was constant shelling from the Kiev military, the Ukrainian military, against the civilian population in these
According
to
Western
places.
sources, it was 14,000
14,000 people killed in total, but some of those were civilians, some of those were military and so on. But yeah, there was lots of civilians.
Thousands of
deaths.
bombs thrown indiscriminately.
Yeah, and at this time, nothing was said in the West about any of this. And this was not a war. This was just, I don't know, an internal conflict that didn't make it into the headlines. Yeah. And no one said, "Oh, we must arm the poor people of Donetsk and Luhansk to resist this oppressive regime." Nothing like that. There's complete double standards and
just to move on. Then we have what's called the Minsk II agreements, because this, at a certain point, this is running out of control. This Kiev regime is radicalizing, and every action has a reaction, and you see a very, very, sharp drift to the right, which then...
There were two other things that happened before the Minsk agreements, and that is that one, the Ukrainian army was defeated, particularly in 2015. If I remember correctly, it was in the summer of 2015 in Debaltseve, where a large number of Ukrainian troops, which were mainly these far-right volunteer battalions, were surrounded and destroyed by the forces of the Donetsk and Luhansk Republic. I mean, some of these people were miners, steel workers who were fighting for their own land. And they also had, at this time, they obviously also had military support from Russia. And the other thing that happened is that while at the beginning the Donetsk and Luhansk republics had a certain autonomy, independence, a homegrown basis, and they were putting forward very radical, very confused statements that involved Russian reactionary nationalism, monarchism, and so on, but also left-wing ideas, anti-fascism, workers' control. There were some elements of nationalization and so on. A Communist Party of Luhansk was created. They had a very strong position in Luhansk. There were some of these brigades who had a political coloring, a left-wing political coloring. But by this time, when Russia decided to more fully support them, all this was clamped down. The more radical left-wing elements in these republics were eliminated, physically eliminated in some cases. The Communist Party was barred from standing in the elections. People were removed, and people who were completely loyal to Moscow were put in all the positions. And so there was very little of the original progressive elements within the republics, where nothing was left. Finally, because of the defeat of the Ukrainian army, they reached a deal. And the deal, Minsk agreement, which was agreed at Normandy. They called it the Normandy format, which involved Russia, Ukraine, and the European powers, which I think was mainly Germany and France. I can't remember if Britain was involved. But anyway, this was the Normandy format for these talks. They arrived at talks, which said what? They said the national and linguistic rights of the people of the south and the people of the Donbas will be recognized. They will be able to have a certain degree of autonomy, elect their own. There going to be local and regional elections. Their linguistic rights are going to be respected, and they will reincorporate themselves into Ukraine, and there will be peace between Ukraine and Russia. This was more or less the terms of the agreement, which will have preserved the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but obviously giving Russia certain degree of leverage into Ukraine, a kind of a neutral position.
They would have a veto power.
Something like that, yes.
Which is more or less what Lavrov was saying. He's saying the West will have interests in our backyard, but we need to have they need to take
certain limits.
There's a certain limit to what they can do.
So this was the Minsk agreements, but the Minsk agreements were never fully implemented because there were never proper elections in Donetsk, in the Donbas. There was never proper recognition of any of these language laws and so on. Why? Because there was strong pressure from the more far-right elements within Ukraine against all of this. And they will sabotage. Every time there was any move towards implementing the Minsk agreement, they will sabotage it and so on. And the government was making concessions to them. To the point where in 2019, is that when Zelensky was elected? Or 2019, I think, yeah. The people had enough in Ukraine. We're not talking about the Donbas here. We're talking about the rest of Ukraine. People had enough of this reactionary nationalist governments, and they elected whom? They elected Zelensky. What platform?
75% against the former Poroshenko government.
Poroshenko was an oligarch. He was the owner of a chocolate factory and other things. Anyway, so people had enough of these oligarchs and reactionary nationalists, and they wanted peace, right? They didn't want any more conflict. They wanted the implementation of the agreements. And Zelensky stood on a peace ticket. And on him, not being an oligarch, he was an outsider, was a comedian from a TV series where he becomes a president. And anyway, so they voted for him for that reason. I was talking to a Ukrainian person here in London the other day, and he said, Zelensky stood on a program that said, I will stop the mothers from crying. There will be no more mothers crying if I win. Peace with Russia. We'll reach a deal which is mutually agreeable, and we'll put an end to this. As soon as he came to power, he came under pressure from the fascist elements inside this government,
from the West.
And also from the West, who wanted a conflict with Russia.
Because if we come closer to today, actually in the months before, Zelensky was saying that Russia is preparing for war. The Americans were stringing him along. No, don't worry. But he was actually ready to make a deal.
Yes.
They were the ones who said, no, we're not going to make a deal. And we're not going to take NATO membership off the table. So in fact, he was...
Yes.
And also even after the war started in April 2022, they made a deal in Istanbul. They made a peace agreement to end the war. Again, the West sabotaged that.
In the form of Boris Johnson being sent to Kiev.
Went to Kiev to break that deal. With the idea of saying we're going to stand with you to the end. You're going to fight this war, and we're going to stand behind you to the end.
Whatever it takes.
And together
for as long as it takes.
For as long as it takes. And together we can defeat the Russians.
Until the last drop of Ukrainian blood.
Yeah.
But there was another incident that we were talking about before, I think is worth mentioning briefly, which is that there was a point in which the Minsk agreements also provided for local control of different regions to be handed over and this and that. And then Zelensky went to one of the flashpoints where the fascists in the National Guard were refusing to give up one particular village. And he went there. He's the president. He's the head of the armed forces. And he instructed them to do so. And they were armed and they refused. And there was a standoff between the presidential guard and Zelensky and these guys. And this kind of showed you the idea that, it's not that the fascists are in power in Kiev, but they are part of the state apparatus now. They're heavily armed. Now they've been armed by NATO. They have an oversized influence in the politics. I think now they're extremely discredited after these 3 years of war. But at that time, they had the power to sabotage the implementation of any deals. And finally, this was the situation. Zelensky changed his position completely, 180 degrees from what the people had voted. And finally, the open war started. But obviously, the conflict had started much earlier.
Yes, and we see this is the situation. It's clear that from a Russian perspective, the Russian regime is not a friend of the Ukrainians, but it's a capitalist regime. It's not a friend of the Russian working class either. It's a capitalist regime, but which realizes that it wants stability on its border. And the way that they were treating Ukraine was precisely in a power sharing agreement. That's what the whole previous period was. Yanukovych, as you say, was balancing between the different powers. The Minsk II agreement was balancing between the two, i.e. giving Russia a veto power while maintaining the old regime, which was a predominantly Western-oriented regime. And as you said, this is the whole history of Ukraine. In reality, you have the Eastern and Western Ukraine, Eastern being more industrial, Western having historically been more agricultural and more peasant, and the Western being Ukrainian, the Eastern being Russian. And the only way to guarantee, on a capitalist basis at least, the unity of this country would have been to accommodate these. And what we have is a reckless push by the Ukrainian nationalists, but then which was supported by the West. This guy that we quoted, he talks about Afghanistan. What was it that happened in Afghanistan? In Afghanistan, the West, they had the dollar jihad, which means that they threw in billions of dollars.
Osama bin Laden.
Which to support the Mujahideen, who were the jihadis and who is in the end created Osama bin Laden. Back then, there was a big interview with Osama bin Laden by Robert Fisk, who was a good journalist, who called Freedom Fighter. It was a big picture of Osama bin Laden in front of the front page of the Telegraph called Freedom Fighter. That's what they did with these guys as well. They armed in the more, how to say, conceptual meaning of the word. They armed this Ukrainian far right people, and in doing so, the whole of the state and the whole of the country slid, and polarization inevitably came out of it. And Ukraine started taking a side. But once Ukraine becomes a regime, a Western, weapon, once the regime turns into a Western weapon, then it's almost inevitable that it will lead to a conflict with Russia. Whether Russia was the first person to cross a border or not, it's quite irrelevant.
Not only will lead to a conflict with Russia, it will lead to civil war inside Ukraine.
Yes.
Because Ukraine cannot be united on the basis of Ukrainian reactionary, pro-Nazi collaborating.
Yes. That would only have been a unity with the crushing of the Russian-speaking population. Yes. That's the only way that it could have been so.
In fact, if you coming to the end of this question, if you want a summary of it,
because that's just the last question that people always say.
Yes.
What Ukrainians' right to self-determination?
Yes, the Ukrainians should have the right to decide what they want, but they haven't had this right for the last 30 years. Yeah. Ukraine for the last 30 years has been ruled by the oligarchs, not by the people, by the Poroshenkos, by the Akhmetovs, the Kolomoiskis, all these people who have looted the country dry, have looted state property, and they have played with Russia and the West for their own benefit. And they have the money in Austria, in Germany, in Cyprus, elsewhere. They're not. So they don't have any country. They don't have any nationality. They don't care. They only want the loot. The people of Ukraine have had no right of self-determination, and now they have it even less, right? Because we're coming to the end of this war. Russia has won militarily, and what seems to be happening at the moment, we don't know exactly how it's going to finish, but what seems to be happening is that now the United States has signed the mineral rights deal with Zelensky. So therefore, the United States is taking a big chunk of whatever is in there.
Yeah.
They don't even know whether it's there or not, but they're basically carving up Ukraine. And Russia will keep what it's taken.
Yeah.
How is this in the interest of the Ukrainian people? It is not. They don't have any self-determination under the domination of Western imperialism, a war that's been created by Western imperialism. So back in 2014, when we were organizing the solidarity with the anti-fascists in Ukraine, most of whom are now either dead, been arrested, or underground, or in exile, was a comrade called Dmitry, and he said to me once, as a summary of the situation, he said, "Look, Lenin created Ukraine, and the Ukrainian nationalists, reactionary nationalists, have destroyed Ukraine." Now, that's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but there's an element of truth.
Yes.
When was Ukraine ever independent? Really independent, not with the Rada, which was dominated by German imperialism, not with the Hetmanate, which was dominated by French and German imperialism. Ukraine was truly independent when the workers and peasants were in power under the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was an independent country. In fact, Lenin insisted against Stalin that the Soviet Union should be the unity on equal terms of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic and the Russian Socialist Federation and the Transcaucasian Federation. There were three separate countries that united into the Soviet Union. In fact, at one point later on, Ukraine had a seat in the United Nations, even though it was part of the Soviet Union. At that time, in the 1920s, the early 1920s, the Ukrainian language was developed. There was a leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party called Mykola Skripnik, who was also a linguist and developed unified the language. There was a development of culture, including the Ukrainian language and so on. That was the period of flourishing of the Ukrainian nation when it was, one way or another, under the control of the workers and peasants who have no interest in fighting the Russians, fighting amongst themselves for the benefit of the oligarchs. And I will say this is the only way that the Ukrainian people can be really independent and sovereign, i.e. when they rise up against the oligarchs, overthrow capitalism, and take control over their own lives. And they can only do so as part of a wider movement of the workers in Russia also taking control. But above all, that also necessitates the workers in the West, us, fighting against our own governments, who've been provoking this war, pushing to the East in order to defend what? Not in order to defend democracy and self-determination, but in order to defend the interests of the Western multinational companies, finance, capital, and the imperialist designs. So I'd say that's the answer. Ukrainian self-determination only makes sense as part of a socialist revolution, the expropriation of the oligarchs.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to say something, but I think you summed it up so well.
Okay.
I think we should end on those exact words. Okay. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation and pick on your brains. It's great that you could make
I would strongly recommend people to reread the material we wrote at that time. I think we should put a list in the description.
People should read it and really study it because there's lots of lessons here. Yes, thank you so much, Jorge, and everyone for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share this episode and other episodes with your friends, family, co-workers, whoever you think might be interested. This was Against the Stream. We'll be back again next Thursday, 6 p.m. UK time. Thank you very much.